Bridget, thank you very much for joining us for this webinar series. We really appreciate the time and the time that you are dedicated to this interview. And of course, we appreciate also the expertise that you share with us regarding the situation and the migration patterns in Haiti and Dominican Republic and all the interesting things that are happening over there. So to start, I will appreciate if you briefly introduce yourself and you tell us where you are and what you do. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much. My pleasure to be here with you this morning. My name is Bridget Wooding, and I'm the director of the Observatory Caribbean Migrants, based here in Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic. We're a think tank which looks at the migration dynamics affecting the Dominican Republic, the island, Hispaniola, the insular Caribbean, from the point of view of the migrants who are here, who leave, and who are in transit elsewhere.
Thank you, Bridget. To start, we will appreciate if you can tell us a little bit about kind of like what has been the history or a little bit of the recent history of human mobility in the island with the Dominican Republic and Haiti and in the Caribbean. I think that will help us to frame especially the conversation around the Haitian migration that we will be interested in hearing more within the interview.
Yes, indeed. Hispaniola is the second largest island in the Caribbean. It's shared to the west by Haiti, to the east, the Dominican Republic. And it's interesting from the point of view that in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, it has one of the longest standing and the most important migration corridors within the whole of the region. That's to say, Haitians moving across for labor migration to the Dominican Republic. Now we're talking about 100 years of such migration. And this was particularly increased at the time when the US occupied a century ago both countries, the 1920s. And for US interests particularly, they had sugar holdings in the Dominican Republic. There was less use for surplus labor in Haiti. They encouraged this migration. So this is a migration that has been going on for a long time. Initially, it was carried out, or at least by the middle of the last century, it began to be carried out by interstate agreements. Interstate agreements between 1952 and 1986, which meant that laborers were recruited to work especially in the sugar cane harvest, and then theoretically they should be repatriated back to Haiti. Now, these agreements lapsed in 1986 when we had a situation where, on the one hand, the Duvalier dictatorship fell in Haiti, and on the other hand, we were having a crisis in the sugar industry. So these interstate agreements lapsed. And what we've had in recent decades has been, by and large, irregular migration, with Haitians in the Dominican Republic being the single largest collective. So we're talking about practically 500,000 people in a total population of around 11 million people. And so that's the situation that we have. Up until fairly recently, there was little attempt to regulate that migration. And what happened with that migration is that we then developed the so-called new Haitian immigration. Now, this was an immigration that went beyond the sugar cane fields. It became available in every niche of the Dominican economy, including the tourist industry and so on. So this is very important to understand that visibility happened. What had previously been enclaves in the sugar plantations now became people who were much more visible on street corners, informal trading, women becoming more important, so-called feminization of migration, where women have been migrating on their own account as chief breadwinners and working in remunerated domestic service as well as small-scale trade. Now, when the Dominican government attempted to regulate this migration, initially it tried to do so by the migration law of 2004, But unfortunately, the migration law was adopted by one outgoing party on 15th of August, and the incoming party on the 16th of August did not really take up the implementation as it should have done. It took up a partial implementation of what was popularly seen to be, again, a migration law directed chiefly at Haitian migration. And so this was a problem. What didn't happen was a special regularization program, which should have happened before the law was adopted. And that only happened a decade later in the end of 2013, when that was mandated for a completely other reason. So what we've had over the years has been largely unregulated migration, an attempt to regulate this migration since the 2014-2015. But that regularization plan has never really worked as it should have done. Were it to have worked as it should have done, it would have given people resident status, instead of which over 200,000 people were given a non-resident status as temporary migrants, which gives them few benefits, few rights are realized, and puts them in a very precarious situation. So that's basically the legal situation that we have. And at the same time, for historical reasons, there has been little integration because Haiti is always seen as the foil to the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic being Spanish-speaking, ex-Spanish colony, Haiti being French Creole-speaking, ex-French colony. Dominican Republic got its first independence from Haiti before getting it from Spain. And so there's been this uneasy tension culminating in such discriminatory relations that under the dictatorship in the Dominican Republic in 1937, there was a so-called massacre of Haitians, Dominican Haitians, on the border when Trujillo, the dictator at that time, attempted to whiten the nation, which was what he was after. And so what you have is a situation of anti-Haitianism. So there is prejudice towards one particular collective. Not so with Venezuelans, which is the second largest collective, much smaller, 100,000 Venezuelans in the country. But you don't have that same level of prejudice that you have with Haitian immigration. So we have a scenario where the migration is significant. It has failed to be properly regulated, failed to be properly integrated, and partly as a result of that, the Dominican Republic is also used as a stepping point for transit migration for Haitians to move to elsewhere in the region. So, for example, one of the issues with the regularization plan, in the banana sector was 14,000 people were regularized, but half that number then left the banana sector, many of whom who had their passports then moved on to what they thought would be greener pastures elsewhere, especially in South America, Brazil, and Chile. So this is the situation that we find ourselves in. And an added complication is the fact that family members of Haitian migrants, children born to Haitian migrants in the Dominican Republic, who should have had the right to a Dominican nationality, have had that right consistently challenged. So I think I'll leave it there for the framing.
Thank you very much, Bridget. I think it's very important to understand how all these human mobility movement and migration between countries really has historical roots, and how the history also helps us to understand that some of the issues have been much more endemic and have remained from centuries or from several years or decades, and how also some of the intervention of other countries also affect the migration patterns. I wonder if before we move about talking about the current issues of Haitian migration, if you could say something about the movement of Haitians to the to Latin American countries, because in other interviews, in other from other regions, we have heard that there's a significant and visible presence of Haitians in different parts of Latin America, Brazil, Mexico, Central America. So I don't know if you can say a little bit about that.
Yes, certainly. I think what is important to remember is that migration began in earnest after the 2010 earthquake. You remember the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, in which over 200,000 people lost their lives. You had 300,000 people under canvas in Haiti. And many people tried to move, not just across the border to the Dominican Republic, but taking advantage of a humanitarian gesture made by Brazil. Now, why Brazil? Brazil is important because at the time Brazil was heading up MINUSTA. You remember there was the UN mission, which was peace building, if you like, in Haiti at the time. And so there were a lot of contacts, football also very important. So you had football, there's contacts with the peacekeeping mission, and Brazil needed laborers. It was into big construction projects with various upcoming important games and so on. So this humanitarian gesture happened. A number of people availed themselves of the opportunity of going to Brazil. And when things didn't necessarily work out in Brazil, they then moved on to Chile or to other countries. Now, what is important to note then is that in terms of what's been going on the US-Mexico border, we have to understand that this has got these historical roots. We're talking about what's been going on fundamentally in the last decade in earnest. So these people who are turning up on the border are not people who are coming directly from Haiti. Most have been living in Brazil, Chile, and other countries in South and Central America for months or for years. Now, migrants began leaving Latin America when job opportunities slowed as these countries have faced the pandemic. And migrants also heard incorrectly that the US was granting temporary protection status to any Haitian on US soil. Also, there were more restrictive migration policies in some of these countries. Already in Chile, Chile had introduced a kind of humanitarian repatriation program and was known to be making it much more difficult for people to have regular status there. So what Haitians have done in the current circumstances and over the last few years, they've been paying coyotes, they've been paying passeurs, they've been paying intermediaries, a wide network of smugglers working across countries who guide the migrants of all nationalities to the US-Mexico border. And many migrants, as you've probably seen in the recent media reports, have paid up to $8,000 to these intermediaries using money saved up from the limited jobs in Latin America or given to them by relatives abroad. So what we've had over the past couple of weeks is nearly 14,000 migrants reach the town of Del Rio on the US side of the US-Mexico border, separated by the Rio Grande. And this has been selected to avoid detection at other places known to be under the radar. So what we've been seeing has been this extraordinary deportations to a country which is challenged by deep political instability. The president was assassinated in the middle of July. The country has suffered an earthquake. The country has suffered in the middle of August. The country suffered then a tropical storm. There's not a very clear functioning government there. So it's been deeply problematic that these deportations have been going on. And as you may have seen, also, the authorities in Haiti, the head of the National Migration Office, has stated that the Haitian state is not ready to receive these deportees. And indeed, the US Special envoy, Mr. Foote, resigned, saying that these policies were deeply flawed. So we have a situation of a very dynamic situation where, unfortunately, people who left the country seeking a better life a decade ago or in more recent years have found themselves back at square one.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for allowing us or for giving us this perspective on what is happening very recently in different corridors of migration patterns in Latin America, especially the border between Mexico and the US. I assume that this is kind of like leads us to our next question, which will be, what are the main issues or the main challenges that you see currently with the migration patterns in Haiti and in the Caribbean region?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Haitian migration is going to continue. It's going to be a revolving door system until basically Haiti is enabled to have a functioning political system, which means more constructive help from the international community than has happened to the present. It means listening to Haitian voices. So the fundamental problems that there are is that it has been enormously difficult for Haitians to regularize their situation, not just in the Dominican Republic, but elsewhere. Even those regional integration systems that have been set up, for example, in CARICOM, the English-speaking islands, which include Haiti in their regional integration, have freedom of movement, but often they make exceptions for Haiti. More recently, Guyana has introduced a visa. So what you have is Haitians are being singled out for more restrictive, more punitive measures in terms of ability to migrate. And that means that they're being put into continuously more difficult situations. And we have a particular situation here in the Dominican Republic where those children born to migrants who up until the 2010 Constitution had the right to Dominican nationality have since 2013 by a Constitutional Tribunal decision had that right negated going back as far as 1929, so that over 130,000 Dominicans of Haitian ancestry had their nationality stripped. And despite remedial legislation, most of them have not yet been able to acquire the papers that they already had or register as allowed for under the legislation which was passed. Now, this is deeply troubling because it is only happening against one ethnic minority and their descendants. It's increasing the vulnerability of these people. And for example, under the pandemic, those people who normally should have been eligible for social protection because of having their Dominican documentation were denied this. Now, yesterday was the 8th anniversary, September the 23rd was the 8th anniversary of this very controversial ruling. And it's to be hoped that the government which took power in the middle of last year in the Dominican Republic is going to address the issue in a more systematic fashion, because it means that the Dominican Republic continues to be a pariah in the region where race relations, ethnic difference is very much on the agenda. And so this is a problem. And what human rights activists are saying is that this needs to be continued to be addressed, not just by the networks within the country, by the regional human rights networks, the Inter-American Human Rights System, by the UN, by international organizations, because it's in danger of falling off the agenda when there are so many other issues which are also affecting Haitians and their descendants elsewhere. So it's a particular issue that we would like to highlight in the Dominican Republic. The groups are very active, trying to get back their nationality, trying to fight for equality. because this is disrupting, very disruptive of full citizenship, any kind of citizenship, or leads to second-class citizenship, which in the context of globalization, which in the context of equality, human rights is, as I say, very, very troubling. And elsewhere in the region, as we have seen, it's not just on the US-Mexico border, but elsewhere, you know, Haitian migrants have been particularly subject to difficult circumstances. You know, on the southern Mexican border, for example, they have been put virtually in internment camps. Elsewhere, on their long route passing through 11 countries from Chile to get to the US border, they often pass through extremely difficult conditions. And this is very, it's not looked at through the normal humanitarian prism. So there definitely does seem to be some black bias, which is happening here, anti-black bias. And in a situation in where Black Lives Matter, I think that this needs to be addressed, you know, in the US, throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, and with particular regard to Haitians, who, despite having been the nation, first Black nation, get their independence, showed a beacon for the rest of the world in terms of decolonialization, yet are subject to extreme human rights abuses independently of the situation in which they find themselves.
Thank you very much, Bridget. Especially thank you for bringing this perspective of social justice, human rights, and race, the race question, into the discussion of human mobility and migration. I think it's very important, kind of, to help us to visibilize these things. To conclude, you know that this interview, to conclude, you know that this webinar, as I mentioned to you, is kind of like trying to reach different audiences, different people that work in the field, that work in migration, that are interested in migration. What would be one last thought that you think people need to be aware in regard to the reality of migration in not only Haiti, but in the Caribbean region? What would be something that you want them to take away?
I think we're all migrants. And so the Caribbean is distinctive because even before migration became such a widespread phenomenon, 1 in 5 people in the Caribbean live permanently outside the island where they were born. Now, and these diasporas are very important. And so I think that we need to be aware that it's not just what happens on our islands in the Caribbean, but what happens in the diaspora. How can Haitian activists join together with Dominican activists in New York to create pressure so that more humanitarian policies, more adequate policies are implemented on the island? This is extremely important. How can people act in solidarity with the so-called Windrush generation? The Windrush generation, those people who left the English-speaking Caribbean, called for by the UK, called for by the mother country, Great Britain, to come and work because of labor shortage, and are now unwanted. And as with the Haitians of Dominican ancestry in the Dominican Republic, are being, you know, denied rights, acquired rights in the UK, and in some cases being deported or expelled back to the Caribbean. So I think we need joined up thinking to look at how migration affects not just the countries within the region, but also in the north, in the global north, and how that can eventually leverage positive change within the global south.
Bridget, thank you very much for your time, for your knowledge, for everything that you have shared with us. We really appreciate your expertise to help us illustrate the things that are happening in the region. And as you said, engaging with the diasporas, it's very, very important in terms of helping to improve the lives of migrants within the region. So thank you very much.
Thank you, my pleasure.